the opposition bench never engaged with in this debate was the way that subtle racism worked. And it wasn't about standing up in the soapbox and having David Irving-style deliveries of why colonisation was a good thing. It was about comparing the values of infrastructure against culture and asking people to objectively determine which one of those was more important. That was the problem with which we took at closing government, and that was something which we never heard any response to. At the end of this debate, I have 3 questions. Firstly, dealing with the extension, does this work as an efficient accountability mechanism? Secondly, do we need a counterfactual to push against the tide, or the overwhelming tide, that colonisation is bad? And thirdly, what does criminalisation actually do? So on to this first question, which deals with the extension. What we heard, that history is really deep, and it's not just like whites versus blacks, it's black versus blacks, slavery is always linked to colonisation, all those kinds of things. So we think the problem necessarily is firstly that the messaging is always the same. Well, the messaging that you take out necessarily isn't the same. And we think there's reasons particularly why that in the Western world in particular, you need to regard colonisation more significantly than you do internal ethnic conflicts. But moreover, we think the problem is the narrative that people take out of this plays into that colonisation stereotype. It's the kind of things that when the Catholic Church, particularly in Spain and Portugal, to this very day still gets up and says that invasion of South America was a good thing because those people were savages and they were killing each other and we delivered them God. That is a good thing that justifies the famine and the genocide of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. We think when you can talk about those people as being savages, you necessarily play into that, and that plays into the wider colonisation narrative. We think that is necessarily a bad thing. But what we took particular issue was the way in which this established subtle attitudes of racism, because it informed your base perception of how these people were, that they were lawless, that they were godless, that they didn't have, God forbid, infrastructure, and therefore the things that we delivered them were necessarily worth the trade. That's what happens, and that is the subtle way in which we're informed, and that is necessarily a negative thing. The second limb of extension we heard was why this chills academia. We think that doesn't happen. Firstly, we think courts can develop clear tests as to what is and what isn't acceptable. But secondly, we think that is such a marginal harm that doesn't necessarily justify its place in this debate at all. Moreover, we think that less speech is necessarily an okay thing to accept if it doesn't further entrench racism, which we see as the problem. Second question in this debate. Do we need a counterfactual? And this is what Karen wanted to suggest, that it's not okay to just harp on about colonisation being bad. You need something to push against that, to discuss that. Different states did different things. Well, we think the counterfactual is harmful for a number of reasons. We think that's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we think white people are always looking to minimise the guilt historically, right? They never want to think that their granddaddy was as bad as he actually was. So we think that you do all kinds of things, right? You assume that the trade-off of infrastructure is necessarily worth all the other bad things that you did. And you think that for a couple of reasons. It's because it remains. Unlike the thousands of people who necessarily had to die for colonisation to exist, you still have things a good postal system and highways. And you necessarily think even if you lost people in the interim, the long-term benefits which those states have gained necessarily justify the harms which took place. We think that's problematic for a couple of reasons, because we think when white people are assessing what those gains are, they look at them at things at which they value more in their life. So you tend to value rules of law, or a really good postal system, or highways as things which are necessarily important to you as a white person, and you disproportionately value those things over things that colonial victims necessarily do, whether that be their pre-existing culture or societal values. As a white person, you can never look at those things as objective, and you always look at them as the things which are important in your life. We think that narrative is necessarily problematic. The second question, but I'll take closing.
Characterization of white people is slightly uncharitable. They're not designed to be racist. They just hear racism and mimic it. They're also smart, percentage people who can read.
Yeah, at best they are, right? That is one of those people. That is not necessarily true. But this is the thing, right? What we told you at closing was it was the subtle way in which it worked. It wasn't that you were outwardly racist. It was that the perception that you had of these states was as people who needed to be saved. It was as people who couldn't have done these things on their own. It was that had the white people not come along to intervene, that those states would have never got there. Just because they were on a different timeline didn't mean they were never going to do it. And moreover, if they never did it, what is the problem with that? If that isn't something that was inherently valued as a cultural importance to them, what is the problem with it? You come in and you oppose a certain set of values which you think are more important. So, second question is that even if you can point to some benefits, and this is the kind of stuff that we heard, that states like Zimbabwe just point to white people as the source of all their problems. So, we think when you are comparative, it is probably fine and probably quite legitimate for Zimbabwe to point to white people as the source of all its problems. If in turn, the outcome is that necessarily you get less
How are the descendants of victims of colonialism better off when extreme racists have a prominent platform to spout their views they would have never had?
Okay, so this goes to the last question. So firstly, you assume that the way in which this works is that there is a huge soapbox for which those people stand up and deliver their message. We told you pretty comprehensively why that wasn't necessarily the case. But moreover, we think it is better if victims don't have to necessarily engage with the subtle signaling that takes place, right? If the message which is dispersed to the vast majority of people is one in which they recognise that colonisation is always necessarily a bad thing, and the good things that came out of that weren't justified, that is the better message to send, and we think you do that far better in this system. What does criminalisation do? What we heard from the opening from Jake, which continued right down the bench, was that you create a soapbox. But he was and this is the comparison which we've always set up, one David Irving, having potentially a soapbox, isn't as bad as a poor historical narrative and a poor historical understanding which transcends across people more broadly. So we thought that was necessarily a problem. The second question we heard was how this shuts down proper debate. Well, we didn't think people that was necessarily going to happen, because we think for the first place, in the places which they spoke about, being Zimbabwe, that is already the signalling that happens. Mugabe gets up and he says that white people were the source of all of these problems. But moreover, we think academia can recognise that he is awful, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to revisionist decide that colonisation was a good thing. We think those things can happen independent of each other. We told you why criminalisation needs to be the standard, because we thought debate had failed and it continues to fail to do so. We told you why it was principally justified, why it was necessary, and we told you why debate was failing to change people's minds.